Look in a mirror right now, or pull up the front camera on your phone. Look at the ring of color around your pupil. That color feels permanent, feels obvious, feels like it's just you, but it isn't simple at all. That color is the end of the chain of accidents that started thousands of years ago, in one body, in one place on Earth. And if your eyes are blue, you are quite literally related to every other blue-eyed person alive today. Same ancestor, same tiny mistake in a strand of DNA. And by the end of this video, you'll never look at a pair of eyes the same way again. Let's start with the moment scientists actually cracked this open, because it wasn't that long ago, and it wasn't what anyone expected. In 2008, a team of researchers at the University of Copenhagen, led by a scientist named Hans Eyberg, sat down with something most people would find boring on paper: DNA samples from blue-eyed people scattered across Denmark, Turkey, Jordan, and a few other countries. Eyberg had spent years chasing a strange pattern. Blue eyes weren't just common in one region. They showed up in unrelated families across huge distances, but always with something odd stitched through them. When his team finally lined up the DNA, they found it. A single tiny change, one flipped switch, sitting near a gene called OCA2. And it was almost identical in every blue-eyed person they tested, no matter where in the world that person's ancestors came from. That's not what you'd expect if blue eyes had popped up over and over again by chance, in different families, in different centuries. Random mutations don't line up like that. Eyberg's team realized they weren't looking at many separate blue eye mutations. They were looking at one, a single founder event. One person, one mistake in their genetic code, sometime in the deep past, and every blue-eyed human on Earth today can trace that piece of DNA back to that one original change. Sit with that for a second, because it's a strange kind of family reunion. If you have blue eyes, and a stranger across the planet has blue eyes, neither of you probably shares a language, a culture, or a recent ancestor you'd ever know about. But you share this: one exact edit to one exact gene, copied down through thousands of generations, landing in both of your eyes at the same time you're watching this video. Before we go any further, it's worth sitting with how recent this discovery really is. Humans have been staring at each other's eyes for as long as humans have existed. We've written poems about eye color, judged strangers by it, built folk sayings around it in nearly every culture on Earth. And yet the actual genetic root of blue eyes, the single mutation, the single ancestor, wasn't confirmed until 2008, not ancient history. Well, within the lifetime of most people watching this. For basically all of human history, nobody actually knew where blue eyes came from. People guessed. People told stories. Some of those stories were harmless. Some of them, as we'll get to later in this video, were used to justify some genuinely ugly ideas. But nobody actually had the answer until modern DNA sequencing made it possible to read the exact letters written inside a cell. Now, before we go any further, we need to deal with something you were probably taught in school, because it's wrong, and it's the thing standing between you and actually understanding your own eyes. You've probably seen the classic genetics chart. Two brown-eyed parents can't have a blue-eyed kid because brown is dominant and blue is recessive, like flipping one light switch. Punnett squares, capital B and lowercase b, a tidy little box that spits out a percentage. It's clean, it's memorable, and it's been taught in classrooms for almost 100 years. It is also, according to modern genetics, an oversimplification bordering on false. Eye color doesn't come from one gene with two settings. It comes from somewhere between 16 and 20 different genes, all nudging the final result in slightly different directions, like dozens of hands adjusting dozens of dimmer switches at once, not one person flipping one switch on or off. Two brown-eyed parents absolutely can have a blue-eyed child, and it happens more than people think, because brown-eyed isn't one single genetic instruction. It's a blend, an average, a compromise between many genes that don't all agree. Here's what that actually looks like in a real family. Imagine two parents, both with brown eyes. Each of them carries a mix of stronger pigment and weaker pigment versions of these 16 to 20 genes, even though their own combination happens to adapt to brown. When they have a child, that child doesn't inherit one clean instruction from each parent. The child inherits a fresh shuffle of all those different gene versions, and if enough of the weaker pigment versions happen to land together by chance, the child can end up with noticeably less pigment than either parent carries. Sometimes low enough to produce blue or green eyes, even though neither parent's own eyes show any hint of that possibility from the outside. It isn't a mutation happening on the spot, and it isn't a sign of anything unusual in the family. It's simply what happens when a trait is built from many genes shuffling independently, rather than one dominant recessive pair. Genetic counselors see this exact situation regularly, and it's one of the most common reasons parents show up confused, wondering how two brown-eyed people ended up with a blue-eyed baby. The old classroom chart simply never had room for an answer that complicated. This matters more than it sounds like it should, because that old one-gene myth has been used, quietly and wrongly, to make eye color sound like a clean genetic signal for other things. Ancestry, purity, even, in some of the ugliest history of the 20th century, racial categories. We're going to come back to that later in this video because it's important, but for now, just hold on to this fact. Eye color is messy, layered, and shared across every population on Earth. It is not a clean dividing line between groups of people. It never was. That one gene myth didn't stay confined to biology class either. For most of the last 2 centuries, plenty of people took the idea that eye color was simple and fixed, and stretched it into something it was never meant to be, a stand-in for personality. You've probably heard some version of these claims. Brown-eyed people are supposedly warmer and more trustworthy. Blue-eyed people are supposedly colder or more independent or better leaders. Green-eyed people get stuck with the mysterious label. None of this comes from genetics. None of it comes from any controlled study that's held up to scrutiny. It comes from folk psychology, old superstition, and a very human habit of turning any visible difference into a story about character. When researchers have actually tried to test these claims properly, controlling for culture and expectation, the supposed link between eye color and personality collapses. What people are usually picking up on is culture, not chromosomes. The expectations a society attaches to a look reflected back at us until it feels like a natural law instead of a stereotype. This is also a good place to bring up something a lot of people have run into personally, without realizing the genetics behind it. At-home DNA ancestry kits that claim to predict your eye color from a cheek swab. These predictions are real science, not a party trick, but they're also not as simple as the marketing makes them sound. Because eye color comes from that whole committee of 16 to 20 genes, rather than one clean switch. DNA-based eye color prediction tools work by scoring the handful of genetic variants known to have the biggest individual effect, PIRC2 and OCA2 chief among them, and using those scores to estimate a probability, not a certainty. For predicting blue versus brown at the extremes, these tools tend to be fairly accurate, often correct more than 80% of the time, because the PIRC2 variant alone carries a lot of weight in that specific comparison. But for green eyes, hazel eyes, and all the in-between shades, accuracy drops noticeably, sometimes down toward the range of a coin flip, because those in-between colors depend on a much larger tangle of smaller effect genes that current tests can't fully account for. So when a DNA kit tells you it's predicting your eye color, what it's actually doing is running a weighted guess based on the genes we understand best, layered over a system we still only partly understand. That's not a flaw unique to these companies. It's an honest reflection of how complicated this trait really is under the hood. There's a darker chapter tied to this same impulse, too, one worth naming honestly rather than glossing over. In the mid-20th century, some of history's worst ideologies leaned on eye color alongside hair and skin color as a supposed marker of racial purity or superiority, a claim that had no scientific basis then and has even less now that we understand how genetics actually works. As we've already covered, and as we'll keep coming back to, eye color genes don't sort neatly along ethnic or national lines. The same blue eye mutation that shows up in Scandinavia shows up in the Middle East and Central Asia too, spread by thousands of years of migration and mixing, not confined to any single group. Using eye color as a genetic marker of superiority isn't just morally wrong, it's factually wrong on the DNA itself. So if it's not one gene, and it's definitely not a window into someone's character, what's actually happening inside your eye to make it blue, brown, green, or somewhere in between? Let's break down the real mechanism in plain terms because the answer is stranger than most people expect. Picture your iris, the colored ring around your pupil, like a thin curtain made of 2 layers. The back layer is almost always dark, packed with a brown-black pigment called melanin. Melanin is the same pigment that colors your skin and hair. More melanin, darker the tissue, less melanin, lighter the tissue. That back layer of your iris is basically always coated in this dark pigment, no matter what color your eyes look like from the outside. Brown eyes, blue eyes, green eyes. That back layer is dark in almost everyone. The difference is the front layer, called the stroma, which is basically a thin, mostly clear layer sitting on top. In brown eyes, that front layer also carries a good amount of melanin, so you're looking at brown on brown, pigment stacked on pigment, and the whole eye reads as a rich, dark color. In blue eyes, that front layer has very little melanin. It's almost see-through. And this is the part that surprises most people. Blue eyes have no blue pigment in them at all. There is no blue paint sitting in your iris. What's happening is closer to what happens in the sky. Here's the everyday comparison that makes it click. The sky isn't blue because there's blue paint floating up there. It's blue because sunlight hits tiny particles in the atmosphere, and blue light, which travels in shorter, tighter waves than red or yellow light, scatters around more than the other colors, bouncing all over the place, while the longer wavelengths pass through more directly. That scattering effect is called Tyndall scattering, and your blue eyes are running the exact same trick, just on a much smaller stage. Light enters that clear front layer of your iris, passes through, hits the dark pigment underneath, and scatters back out. And the color that scatters best, the color that bounces back to your eye, is blue. You're not looking at a pigment, you're looking at a tiny optical trick, a scrap of sky, sitting in a ring around your pupil. Green and hazel eyes sit in between. They usually have a small amount of a yellow-brown pigment called lipochrome mixed into that same clear front layer, and when that faint yellow tint combines with the same blue scattering effect happening underneath, it reads to your eye as green, or a shifting hazel that seems to change color depending on the light around you. So every eye color you've ever seen comes down to two ingredients working together. How much dark pigment is sitting in that front layer, and how much of the sky trick of light scattering is happening underneath it. Two ingredients. 16 to 20 genes fine-tuning exactly how much of each ingredient shows up. That's why eye color isn't one clean on-off switch. It's a recipe, and recipes have a lot of ways to turn out slightly different. It helps to picture the cells actually doing this work. Pigment gets built by specialized cells called melanocytes, tiny factories that manufacture melanin and pack it into little containers inside themselves. During development, before you were even born, these melanocytes migrate into place throughout your body, into your skin, your hair follicles, and that thin front layer of your iris. How many melanocytes show up, how active each one is, and how much melanin each one packs away is where all 16 to 20 of those genes get their say. Some genes control how many melanocytes get made in the first place. Others control how hard each one works. Others control what type of melanin gets produced, because there are actually two main flavors, a brownish-black type called eumelanin and a reddish-yellow type called pheomelanin. And the ratio between the two shifts the final shade even further. It's less like one recipe with one chef and more like an entire kitchen staff, each following slightly different instructions, all plating the same dish. This is also where we need to knock down another myth that gets repeated constantly, because it plays directly off the mechanism we just described. You've probably heard someone say their eyes change color when they're angry or sad or wearing a certain shirt. Mood rings built an entire toy industry own A version of this idea. Here's the honest science answer. Your iris pigment isn't shifting because of your emotions. What can shift is your pupil size, and how much light is hitting that thin, scattering front layer of your eye. When you're upset, or your pupils dilate for other reasons, the stroma stretches or compresses slightly, changing how light bounces through it. And that can genuinely make hazel or light-colored eyes look a little different, a little greener, a little grayer, depending on lighting and pupil size. But it's an optical shift, not a chemical one. The underlying pigment recipe in your iris isn't rewriting itself because you had a bad day. It's the same trick as the sky looking different at sunset versus noon. Same sky, different light bouncing off it. Now let's zoom all the way out, because the story of where blue eyes actually came from is one of the strangest detective stories in modern genetics. Go back roughly 6,000 to 10,000 years. Somewhere in the region around the Black Sea, the area that today touches parts of modern Turkey, Georgia, Ukraine, and southern Russia, one person was born with a tiny copying error in their DNA. Not in the gene that makes melanin itself, but in a nearby switch region that controls how much that gene gets turned on inside the iris. That switch sits right next to the OCA2 gene we mentioned earlier, but the actual mutation lives inside a neighboring gene called HER2. Think of HER2's job here less like a paint gene and more like a light switch cover for the OCA2 paint gene sitting right beside it. The mutation didn't destroy OCA2. It just partially disabled the switch that turns OCA2 on inside the iris. So instead of pumping out a normal amount of pigment into that front layer of the eye, a much smaller amount got made. And just like that, one person's eyes went from the ancestral dark brown to a pale, scattering blue. That one switch flip in one person is the entire root of every blue eye on the planet today. Everyone. Not similar mutations that happened again and again in different places, which is what usually happens with common traits. This is one single genetic event, copied forward through parent to child, generation after generation, spreading outward from that one region near the Black Sea as populations moved, traded, migrated, and mixed across thousands of years. It's worth understanding just how careful that comparison had to be. DNA is enormous, 3 billion individual letters packed into every human cell, so finding one meaningful change buried inside all of that isn't like spotting a typo on a page. It's closer to finding one specific misprinted letter somewhere across a library of 1,000 books, and confirming that the exact same letter in the exact same word on the exact same page is misprinted in every single copy on every single shelf. Iberg's team had to sequence the relevant stretch of DNA across dozens of unrelated blue-eyed volunteers from noticeably different backgrounds and geographic regions, Then line those sequences up side by side, letter by letter, looking for the one shared anomaly, running through all of them. That kind of comparison is exactly what modern gene sequencing technology made possible for the first time in the years leading up to that 2008 study, a level of precision that simply didn't exist for earlier generations of scientists, no matter how curious they were about the same question. That's what made Iberg's 2008 discovery so remarkable. When his team compared the DNA of blue-eyed people from Denmark all the way to Jordan, they weren't finding a bunch of different, independently evolved versions of a blue-eye gene. They were finding the exact same molecular scar, letter for letter, in every single sample. It's the genetic equivalent of finding the same, extremely specific typo in millions of copies of a book. You don't conclude that thousands of printers all made the identical accidental mistake on their own. You conclude every copy came from the same original manuscript. Which raises an obvious question. Why did this trait spread at all? A random mutation that shows up in one person usually just fades out over a few generations and disappears, statistically speaking. For this one to spread across huge populations and survive for thousands of years, something about it had to help those people survive, reproduce, or both. Scientists have a few leading theories, and it's worth walking through them honestly, because none of them is fully settled science. This is one of those areas where we don't know for certain yet is the most accurate answer. One leading idea connects to where humans were living. As early humans moved north out of Africa into higher latitudes, places with weaker sunlight, longer winters, and far less UV exposure than equatorial regions, lighter skin and lighter eyes may have offered a real survival advantage. Your body needs sunlight hitting your skin to make vitamin D, which your body then uses to build strong bones and keep your immune system working. Darker skin, which has fantastic protection against UV damage near the equator, blocks so much sunlight that in low-light northern regions, people with darker pigmentation risked vitamin D deficiency, along with all the health problems that come with it. Weakened bones, higher risk of certain illnesses, harder pregnancies. Lighter skin lets more of that limited northern sunlight in. Eye pigment and skin pigment are controlled by overlapping genetic machinery. So as lighter skin spread through northern populations for this vitamin D advantage, lighter eyes may have simply come along for the ride, riding on the same genetic changes. There's a flip side to this same UV story worth understanding. Because pigment isn't only about vitamin D, it's also about protection. Melanin in the eye isn't just decorative, it absorbs some of the UV and high-energy light hitting the eye before that light can reach and damage the more delicate structures behind the iris, similar to the way melanin in skin helps absorb UV before it can damage cells deeper in the skin. That's a real trade-off, not a one-sided win. Near the equator, where sunlight is intense and year-round, heavily pigmented eyes offer a genuine protective advantage, filtering out more damaging light in an environment that has plenty of light to spare, with no vitamin D shortage to worry about. Move toward the poles, into environments with weaker, more seasonal sunlight, and that same heavy filtering becomes less necessary for protection, while the vitamin D cost of blocking out already scarce sunlight becomes a bigger problem. In other words, the right amount of eye pigment was never fixed. It was a balancing act, shaped by exactly how much sunlight a given population was actually living under. Generation after generation, for thousands of years, blue eyes weren't an upgrade over brown eyes in some absolute sense. They were a regional adjustment tuned to a specific set of lighting conditions, the same way a thermostat gets set differently for different climates, rather than one setting being objectively better everywhere. A second theory has nothing to do with survival at all, and everything to do with attraction. Some researchers argue that blue eyes spread partly through simple mate preference, that a rarer, unusual trait stood out, got noticed, and got chosen more often as a partner, the same way certain features become more common in a population purely because people found them appealing and picked partners who had them. This is much harder to prove scientifically than the vitamin D theory, since you can't run a controlled study on prehistoric dating habits, but it remains a serious hypothesis discussed in genetics literature. The honest answer is probably some mix of both forces, tangled together with plain chance, and possibly other pressures we haven't identified yet. What we do know for certain, because it's written directly into the DNA, is where it started and roughly when. What we also know is how the mutation actually traveled, and that story runs straight through one of the biggest population shifts in human history. Around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, a group of herders and horse riders known to archaeologists as the Yamnaya began expanding out of the grasslands north of the Black Sea and Caspian Sea, spreading west into Europe and east into Central Asia. Ancient DNA studies have found that Yamnaya populations, and the groups that mixed with them, carried a noticeably higher rate of the blue eye variant than the earlier farming populations already settled across Europe at the time. As these groups moved, intermarried, and folded into local populations across thousands of years, they carried that single mutation along with them, seeding it into gene pools across an enormous stretch of territory, which is exactly why, today, you find that same one exact genetic scar in people whose ancestors lived nowhere near each other, from Scandinavia to the eastern Mediterranean to parts of Central Asia. It wasn't magic, and it wasn't several separate lucky accidents. It was one mutation, riding along inside real people on real migrations over thousands of real years. Now here's where the story gets a genuine plot twist, one that upended assumptions a lot of people didn't even realize they were carrying. Before you keep going, if learning that your own eye color carries a 10,000-year paper trail has you wondering what else is quietly written into your DNA, that's exactly the kind of thing this channel exists to dig into. Stick with us, because the next part of this story is where things get genuinely strange. For decades, popular imagination pictured ancient Europeans as basically looking like modern Northern Europeans already. Pale skin, light eyes, the whole package, stretching back tens of thousands of years, as if the look arrived all at once with the first humans to settle the continent. Then, in 2014, researchers analyzed the genome of a roughly 10,000-year-old skeleton found in Cheddar Gorge, England, a specimen that eventually became known as Cheddar Man, one of the oldest fairly complete human skeletons found in Britain. When the ancient DNA was sequenced, the results surprised almost everyone. Cheddar Man very likely had dark brown or black skin and blue eyes. Dark skin, blue eyes. Living in what is now England 10,000 years ago. That combination doesn't fit the tidy mental picture a lot of people carry around, the one where skin color and eye color are supposed to travel together as a package, sorted neatly by geography. But genetics doesn't work like a matching outfit. Skin pigmentation genes and eye pigmentation genes, while related, don't move on the exact same timeline. The genetic changes that eventually spread lighter skin broadly across Europe took longer and spread later than the blue eye mutation that had already been circulating for thousands of years by that point. Cheddar Man is living proof that these traits didn't arrive as a bundle. His body carried one part of that ancient blue eye mutation from the Black Sea region, passed down through his ancestors, while his skin still carried the older, darker pigmentation of populations that hadn't yet picked up the newer, lighter skin variants. Two separate genetic stories, moving at two separate speeds, sitting inside one person. Eye color isn't only a story about the deep past either. It carries real, measurable effects in modern bodies too, and some of them run in surprising directions. Less pigment in the eye means less natural protection from ultraviolet light, which is part of why people with lighter eyes tend to be somewhat more light sensitive, and why some studies have found a modestly higher risk of certain UV-linked eye conditions, like specific forms of macular degeneration, in populations with lighter eye pigmentation. On the flip side, some research has suggested darker eyes may carry a slightly different balance of health trade-offs and other conditions tied to pigment cells elsewhere in the body. None of these differences are large, none of them are destiny for any individual person, and researchers are still working out exactly how much of this is really about eye pigment specifically versus the broader pigmentation genetics that travel alongside it. But it's a good reminder that these genes were never just about appearance. Melanin's main biological job, everywhere in the body, is protection from the sun, and the amount you have shapes real physical outcomes, not just how you look in a photo. There's also a well-known chapter in modern history that shows just how powerful and how arbitrary eye color can become as a social dividing line, even with zero biological basis behind the divide. In 1968, the day after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., a third-grade teacher in Iowa named Jane Elliott ran a now-famous classroom exercise with her students. She divided the class by eye color, blue-eyed children versus brown-eyed children, and, for one day, told the class that blue-eyed children were smarter and better behaved, giving them privileges the brown-eyed children didn't get. The next day, she reversed it. Within hours, children who had never thought twice about their own eye color, or anyone else's, began treating classmates differently, performing differently on tasks, and describing themselves differently, based purely on which group they'd been told they belonged to. Nothing about their actual eyes had changed. Only the story attached to them had. It became one of the most cited classroom demonstrations in the study of prejudice, precisely because eye color has no real connection to ability or character, which made it the perfect, clean test case for showing how quickly people absorb an arbitrary label and start living inside it.